So here we are beginning chapter 16, which is all about the innate host defenses. And so in this lecture, we're going to first look at the second form of defense that we have. That would be the adaptive defense. Just a brief kind of introduction to that. That's where we'll spend most of the next chapter is looking at adaptive defenses. And then we'll start to dive deep into the innate defenses. So here we go. So the adaptive defenses, the ones that we're really going to get into in chapter 17, are also known as the specific defenses. They're called adaptive because we develop these. They are we're not born with them, but as we encounter new antigens in the environment, we adapt to those antigens. They're referred to as specific defenses because they allow us to respond to very, very specific antigens. Antigens are proteins or glycoproteins or other molecules that, if it's a bacterium, that would be found on the capsule or on the cell membrane of the bacteria. It's something that our body recognizes as not being part of the usual markers that we see on body cells. And these adaptive defenses have the ability to respond to very specific antigens only. And so that's why we talk about them as specific defenses. So the way that they work is that if lymphocytes, these are specialized white blood cells, if these lymphocytes encounter one of these non-self antigens, then they become activated, and we see one of two responses to them. We either destroy the antigen and whatever cell bears that antigen, or we produce antibodies. These are another protein, but they're made by our own bodies. Then we produce these antibodies, and the antibodies are then found in the body fluids, and when they come across one of the antigens that they are very specific to, they bind to it, they latch onto it. There's a chemical reaction that puts the two of them together, and then they act almost like a big flag out there waving, saying, hey, come and eat me. And so they attract cells that are phagocytic, that will engulf the antibody, the antigen it's bound to, and the antigens, the source of the antigen, the cell that the antigen is on. So all of that will be destroyed with the help of these phagocytes that the antibodies call in. So these act as a second line of defenses, let's say. They're called into action only if the body can't resist the pathogen, whatever the bad thing is that's gotten into the body, if it can't resist it with what are termed the innate defenses. Things that are innate, these are things that you're born with. And so the innate defenses are the first line of defense against a pathogen's invasion or its ability to set up an infection in the body. And rather than being specific, they are non-specific because they respond to any pathogen that is present in the body, or they're there defending against anything that might come and try to enter the body. So it's the job of the innate defenses to prevent pathogens from entering the body, and if they do, to destroy those pathogens or inactivate any toxic materials or products that they produce. So what are some of these innate defenses? Well, there are physical barriers. So our skin, for instance, is a physical barrier that prevents lots and lots of things from getting in, as well as keeping moisture out, moisture inside the body too. So, it does a lot of functions for us. So skin is one barrier. Mucous membranes are another. So if we look inside the nose or into the reproductive tract or the urinary tract or the digestive tract, or anywhere we find mucous membranes. And so the chemicals that skin and mucous membranes secrete are also part of this physical barrier. Then there are the chemical barriers. These are antimicrobial materials that are found in saliva, in mucus, in gastric juices, in tears, and they are chemicals that limit the amount of iron that it becomes available to bacteria in body fluids. And by limiting the amount of iron, that also limits the growth of these pathogens, because bacteria frequently, one of the limiting factors for their growth is access to iron. So physical barriers, chemical barriers, also cellular defenses. This is provided by white blood cells that recognize things that don't belong and phagocytize them, that engulf them and digest them. Inflammation is another kind of innate defense. So inflammation helps to prevent materials that have entered the body from getting any further than that site where they have invaded. Fever also has a real defensive characteristic to it. By elevating body temperature, we may kill off microorganisms that have invaded or inactivate the enzymes that are running their metabolic processes, making it harder for them to grow or inactivating the toxins that they are releasing. And then last of all, there are molecular defenses. These are materials or chemicals that are made by the body to help defend against virus infection or against any things that get into the body. So interferon and complement are both examples of these molecular defenses. And so we're going to dive deep. We're going to learn more about these in the coming lectures. Okay, so let's start by talking about these physical barriers. Skin, if you remember from an anatomy and physiology class that you may have had, epithelial tissues like skin are very tightly joined together. So they have these intercellular connections that hold them very closely together and don't prevent molecules or bacteria or other stuff. They prevent them from getting through these layers of epithelial cells. So skin makes our bodies very resistant to invasion. If you remember again from an A&P class, we make new skin cells at the basal layers of the epidermis, and we lose those skin cells at the surface of the skin, so they come flaking off. But of course, skin can't be a perfect barrier. It has to be able to stretch and move and be supple, and so that makes it subject to scratches or bites or to heat and cold damage. All of us have been burned or have had that kind of experience. Sunlight can be damaging to the skin. Chemicals that we might encounter, all of these can help to break a hole or to make a tear in the skin layer that helps to prevent bacteria from getting into our bodies. Once we enter a body cavity, then we encounter a different kind of physical barrier, and those are the mucous membranes, and they line all the organs, the interior surfaces of all of the organs that are involved in the body cavities that have an outlet to the external environment. So when we think about mucous membranes, we find them in the digestive tract, in the urinary system, in the reproductive system, and in digestive, urinary, reproductive, and respiratory system. So those 4 body systems all are lined with mucous membranes. And the cilia, I don't know why I said hairs, that's bad. Let me scratch that out and we'll replace that with, there are hairs, but we're thinking more of cilia though. And the mucus that the cells of the epithelium, this mucous membrane, make, they help to sweep pathogens out of the respiratory system and either send them up the trachea where we can then swallow them into the stomach, or we can, if they're up in the nose, then we can sneeze or cough to get rid of whatever we've has been trapped in the mucus and waved up toward the mouth. Vomiting and diarrhea are both effective means of purging the body of microbes and toxins that may have been consumed in some way. Tears and saliva flush bacteria from the eyes and from the mouth. The eyes are also lined with a mucous membrane. And then urine. Urine tends to be, if you don't have a kidney or bladder infection, urine tends to be sterile. And so as we urinate, then that helps to flush any bacteria from the distal ends of the tubes that make up the urinary system. So mucous membranes and skin serve as really important physical barriers, preventing bacteria from entering the body. We also produce a lot of chemicals that act as barriers as well. So sweat has a fairly high salt content and a reasonably acidic pH, and so it can be bacteriostatic, not killing bacteria, but certainly limiting their ability to grow. Sebum has an acidic characteristic to it and if you recall, sebum, that's the oils that are produced by the sebaceous glands, plus all of the dead cell parts and whatever else might get wadded up into your pores. So sebum has an anti or a bacteriostatic effect as well. The stomach secretions that have very, very low pH, that are acidic, those stomach secretions are bactericidal for many bacteria. Saliva, tears, and also mucus contains an enzyme called lysozyme. Lysozyme can digest sugars and peptidoglycan, and because of that, can also then kill off gram-positive bacteria by destroying their capsule and then rendering them, subject to osmotic stress, so they might bust or they might dehydrate. Blood plasma contains a set of proteins. They're referred to as transferrins. These are the transferrins. I'm sorry, I should say that correctly. That's fair for iron. So these are enzymes that can bind up any free iron that they come across and create an environment, as I was saying before, that is low in iron and therefore helps to limit bacterial growth. And saliva, mucus, and milk, so breast milk, contains a similar molecule called lactoferrin, and lactoferrin does the same thing. It binds up free iron and transports it to other places. And then last of all, mucus contains short strings of amino acids, so small proteins called peptides. That's a string of amino acids that's like fewer than 100 amino acids long. And these are called defensins, and they are able to destroy pathogens by poking little holes in their membrane. So they make these pores in the membrane, and then the cells' contents leak out and they die. So all of these chemicals have a bacteriostatic or bactericidal effect and help to serve as a barrier, preventing the bacteria or whatever, the pathogen from entering the body. So if those physical barriers are breached then, and that happens especially this time of year with dry skin that cracks open, or if you get a paper cut, or you have a kitchen accident, or you're flossing your teeth and you make some cuts into the gums, all of that can breach these physical barriers that we have around the body. And it's then that cellular defenses spring into action. And so cellular defenses are provided by the leukocytes, the white blood cells that are found both in the blood and in all body fluids, or in the tissue fluids that are all around the cells. And so these leukocytes, these white blood cells, are able to crawl around like little amoebae, and when they encounter pathogens or cells that have become cancerous or been infected with viruses, or anything that has a non-self molecule, an antigen that doesn't belong in the body, then they will engulf and digest whatever that material is. So leukocytes, they're produced in red bone marrow by the hematopoietic stem cells. That's the term we use for it in anatomy and physiology. Here in this book, they refer to it as a pluripotent stem cell. That is a stem cell that is capable of becoming any number of cells. So these are all the different kinds of white blood cells and red blood cells and platelets that that one of these stem cells that's found in red bone marrow can produce. And so you can look at the pathways here. So if we head this direction, then we can make red blood cells. If it instead becomes one of these myeloid stem cells, then it could become a cell that's going to make platelets, or it could become one of the granulocytes here, the basophils, eosinophils, neutrophils, or dendritic cells, or it might become a monocyte. Or if it goes down this pathway and develops into, the cells that it buds off or that it divides off, develop into lymphoid stem cells, then they will become either a B lymphocyte, a T lymphocyte, or one of these NK cells. NK stands for natural killer cells. And so we have red blood cells, platelets, and then all of the leukocytes that together are referred to as the formed elements of the blood. So some of the leukocytes that we can find in the blood, they are the granulocytes. So this group, when you stain them, they become really grainy looking. The cytoplasm is really grainy looking because they have relatively large lysosomes and secretory vesicles that are found in the cytoplasm. Remember, lysosomes are little membranous sacs that are filled with digestive enzymes. Secretory vesicles are filled with whatever cell product the cell might make. And they develop, the granulocytes develop from the myeloid stem cells that are produced from that pluripotent stem cell as it divides and grows and divides and grows and divides. So the granulocytes include the basophils, mast cells, eosinophils, neutrophils, and dendritic cells. So there's a bunch of these granulocytes. Basophils, the capacity to release histamine, and in that process trigger inflammation. Mast cells also release histamine, and they're frequently located in connective tissue or near the blood vessels. So if you cut yourself and you bleed, then mast cells might spring into action, releasing histamine and triggering inflammation. Eosinophils, they're named eosinophils, by the way, because the dye eosin is really good at staining these cells. They're present mostly when there's allergic reactions or if there is a worm parasite found in the body. I should have mentioned basophils. They're called basophils because they accept basic stains best. Neutrophils, also known as polymorphonuclear leukocytes, how's that? PMNLs. Neutrophils, they get their name because neutral stains, rather than basic stains, work best to stain them. They're called polymorphonuclear leukocytes because they have nuclei that are in multiple shapes. So there's, when you look from neutrophil to neutrophil to neutrophil, you may see different shapes in each one of those cells. So that's that polymorph. Polymorph means different, many shapes, and nuclear because it's about the nucleus. These guys defend against infection in the blood, in skin, in mucous membranes, and they're capable of acting as phagocytes. And then last of all, the dendritic cells. These are involved in helping to initiate adaptive defenses. So we'll talk more about dendritic cells in the next chapter. But they will engulf and destroy things and then decorate their own cell membranes with the antigens of the thing that they just bit up. Okay, so there's granulocytes. Another type of or grouping of leukocytes are the agranulocytes. It's not that they don't have vesicles, it's just that the vesicles are small. And so when you stain the cell, they're too small to see the individual vesicles like you can with the granulocytes. And so they have a much more smooth, kind of even staining characteristic. Two primary agranulocytes, the monocytes, are one group. These are also made like the granulocytes. They're derived from the myeloid stem cells. Monocytes will circulate in the blood, and then they do that for like 24 hours, give or take. And then they move into the tissues and become what are referred to as macrophages. So the big eaters is what macro means large or big. Phage is eating. So these are the phagocytes, fairly large cells that roam through the tissues, eating up anything that doesn't belong. The other group of agranulocytes are the lymphocytes. And as I mentioned before, there's a couple of different lymphocytes. They are derived not from the myeloid stem cells, but from lymphoid stem cells. And they're involved in active immunity. And so we will look again, they will be the primary subject of the next chapter. And they can also act as phagocytes, these lymphocytes can. Okay, so the last slide then for this lecture. Phagocytes, these are white blood cells that roam through the tissues. They engulf and digest cells, any cellular debris, so they're the big cleaner-uppers, and any bacteria that might have invaded the body. And the two primary phagocytes are neutrophils. Neutrophils, remember, are one of the granulocytes. And there's something on the order of 50 trillion of these dudes circulating at any one time. They tend to be first on the scene if there's an infection, and they are big on phagocytizing bacteria and small particles, those cell debris and stuff. And because they only have the capacity to munch on something, anywhere between 1 and 2 dozen bacteria, depending on the size of the bacteria, they tend to self-destruct within just a couple of days of maturing and beginning to circulate around. So once they have eaten their maximum of bacteria, then they go through this process of apoptosis, where they kind of in a very orderly way commit suicide. So those are the neutrophils. There are also monocytes, that's the other primary group of phagocytes that act in the innate defenses. And they circulate, as I was saying, in blood for about 24 hours, and then they migrate to the tissues and mature into macrophages, which are capable of engulfing and destroying fairly large particles. These guys, unlike the neutrophils, these guys may live for months or even years. And we talk about the ones that take up residence in a particular tissue and don't ever leave. Those guys are fixed macrophages, while there are other macrophages that circulate around in the blood, and then when they get to a spot where they've got a chemical signal attracting them, then they hop out of the blood and move into the tissues to eat up pathogens. So those are the wandering macrophages. Okay, there you have it. The physical and chemical defenses, and then some of the cellular defenses that are found in the body that will take out, virtually anything that might get into the body. Okay, you know what to do if you have any questions.